I call the Honourable Annette King.
Mr Speaker, I may have misheard the Minister when she started her speech this evening, but it sounded to me like she said the government has started on a vicious program of reforms. And I thought, she's right. She's absolutely right. Well, she's not denying it, so I presume that is exactly what she had said when she opened her speech on this new piece of legislation tonight. A vicious program of reforms, because that is what we have seen in Housing New Zealand under this government. What we've seen in the last 7 years in housing policy have been a series of ideological burps. In other words, nothing but a lot of hot air and gas wrapped up in biased and unbalanced philosophy of the National Party. And the greatest exponents of this ideological burping are Dr Nick Smith and Paula Bennett. And Paula Bennett, the latter, is the architect of this latest iteration of dopey policy, and that is what this policy is. This bill is another piece of National Party tripe, and it's meant to give the Minister flexibility to negotiate contracts with organisations that will purchase state houses. What it is a code for the Great State House Sell-Off Mark II. And it's a continuation of an attack on state homes in New Zealand and the sell-off of them by this National Party and the breaking of a solemn promise made before the last election: there would be no more asset sales. There can be no bigger asset for an individual in New Zealand than the home that they live in. And this government is prepared to sell thousands and thousands of state houses off. And they say it's not an asset sale, and they say it's not a broken promise. Well, I would say there is a name for that, Mr Speaker. Perhaps I won't use it today. But that was a solemn promise: no more asset sales. And this is part of the continuation of selling assets in this country. You see, it's followed a pattern. And what this government has done to soften up the people of New Zealand, those that perhaps are not in state houses, they would first of all remove people from the state houses. And you saw that, those of you who come from the Hawke's Bay, and you only need to go into Flaxmere and places like that, they cleaned the people out of the state houses. They left them empty. And then they would say, nobody wants to live in those houses, even though there were people who couldn't get a house. And they're on a waiting list, and the houses are empty. So they said no one wants to live in those houses. Then they say, well, these houses must be in the wrong place and the wrong size, because nobody wants to live in them. So then they let them stay empty, and they lie empty. And then the vandals come along, and then they break the windows, and they graffiti them. And then the government say they get complaints about the security of these properties and the cost of this security. And then they say there's a great necessity to sell them off because we don't need these houses anymore. You see, it is a pattern, Mr Speaker. It is a pattern that we have seen many times over. And now we have got, as I said, the Great State House sell-off, and it was all going to be sold to those very willing community groups. And the poster people of this Great State House sell-off was the Salvation Army. The Salvation Army, they, according to Bill English, was going to take all these houses. Well, I've met with the Salvation Army. So have many others in this House met with the Salvation Army. And I have to say, they were played as fools, because they didn't know the real effort that was going into this. They didn't know the real agenda. And when they went away and did their figures and looked at their books, they said there is no way we can buy these houses. We will be in debt for 10 years if we buy these houses. We cannot do it. But we were told the Salvation Army were very willing buyers for community housing. You see, backbenchers might know that. Go out and talk to your Salvation Army. Speak to those who run the Salvation Army, and they will tell you the truth. You were sold a pup by the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister. You were sold a pup because they had no intention, they do not have any intention of providing houses, buying off houses for community housing in New Zealand. Then, Mr Speaker, I had a look at the regulatory impact statement that goes with this bill. And there are a number of questions. I always read these with interest because it usually tells you a little bit about what goes on in policy making. And the regulatory impact statement is asked the questions. Are there any publicly available inquiry, review or evaluation reports that have formed or are relevant to the policy to be given effect in this bill? What would you think the answer to that would be? Do you think there's been any evaluation on this policy? What will be the effect on people? Would you expect them to know that before they brought in some legislation into this House to pass through every stage tonight without the scrutiny of a select committee? Wouldn't you want to know that before you did it? Well, what does it say? No, there has been no evaluation reports to inform or are relevant to the policy. So we're going blind into this. We have no idea what the outcome's going to be. Then we're asked, were any regulatory impact statements provided to inform the decision of this bill? Well, then we were told they used the regulatory impact statement that was done in March. And that was before the community housing groups knew what the real story was and before the Salvation Army pulled out of this whole approach. They also said, did the regulatory impact team in the Treasury provide an independent opinion on the quality of any of these regulatory impact statements? What would you think the answer to that would be to the members opposite? We're passing it through all stages tonight. We're going to put this into legislation without any scrutiny other than what's happening now. And did Treasury have a look at this? Did Treasury provide any independent opinion on the quality of this? The answer to this is no. That hasn't happened. You see, why don't we learn? There is no need to rush this through tonight. What is the urgency of passing this legislation tonight without the scrutiny and the impact and the input from New Zealanders on this bill? So Treasury hasn't had anything to say on this bill either. Has there been any further analysis become available since this policy has been given effect to this bill? What would you think the answer to that would be? Well, it's another big fat no. And I think the members opposite who are going to speak on this bill might want to go and pick up the regulatory impact statement, then ask questions of your minister, where the backbench is so pleased and proud to praise her. But maybe they might want to ask a few questions as to why this bill has not had the scrutiny I believe that it deserves. Then I want to know, and maybe the minister will answer this when we get to the committee stages, she's going to have power in this legislation to make delegated legislation with ministerial direction. That doesn't come to the House either. All she has to do is gazette it, present a copy to this House, having done some consultation. I want to know why this power, an extension of this power, is going to be needed, Minister. Why is this going to be needed when we know there already exists in the Act powers that you can use? I would like an answer to that when the Minister gets into the chair. And so, Mr Speaker, we then get to what has really been happening to Housing New Zealand and why I don't trust this latest measure. Because any of those who are constituency members of this House would have seen what has happened to Housing New Zealand over the last few years. They have stripped away their functions. They've sold houses up and down around New Zealand. They have milked the dividends out of Housing New Zealand. They've closed offices and they have sacked tenancy managers. That is what has happened. That is the legacy of the National Party State House policy. And I have to say, the latest story I heard, and Minister might like to answer this. There are two-storied Housing New Zealand houses in Dunedin. They have just been renovated in some way, and they have ladders, fire escape ladders, because if you're on the second floor, you might need to get out in the event of a fire. Those ladders have been removed, and Housing New Zealand said no, and we're not going to replace them. That is a very good indication of what has happened to Housing New Zealand and state houses in this country. A mean, vicious, nasty approach, because many members opposite, and not all of them, but many members opposite think those that end up in state houses deserve it, they got themselves there, and they're getting what they deserve in the sort of housing they are prepared to provide.
I call